outside of Minneapolis, the occasion that is a real emotion. Today is in part trying to not just plan for it, though, by a uniform presence, by increasing our staffing, by ensuring a good command and control and execution of our strategies to facilitate lawful and peaceful demonstrations and isolate and deal with individuals who are violent or creating property damage or such as arson and looting. But it's also to be preemptive in the sense of all of us as a Los Angeles, as one community, to come together and think about and understand the trauma, the hurt, the injury, the frustration, the anger with this system that we have in America, with a number of systems. And that we know and can expect that a person going through trauma and grief can lash out in anger, can lash out and believe that violence has some sense of relevance in society. So how do we avoid that? And I think part of that is by our faith leaders, by our community advocates, by people who have a stake, not just law enforcement. Law enforcement, we represent a badge, a uniform, 150 years of, to many in communities, an opposition, a suppression. So this is not about what we're going to do. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time telling you what we're going to do to suppress this outrage, to suppress this anger. That's not what we need to be talking about. What we need to be talking about is recognizing that this trauma exists. And this anger and frustration exists in our communities, and it has a footing, it has a basis. And so how do we work through that as a community? And we work through it by not just anticipating it, but also how do we deal with this moral arc of the universe, this long arc that's bent towards justice, but it can't just be about promised justice. It has to be about the fact that as we grieve, that we also join, that law enforcement joins with our communities and recognizing this frustration, this anger, and to try to funnel and shape it in a fashion that builds on justice and builds on a future. Sheriff?
I don't know if I can follow that. That's very eloquent. But I will say this, we'll be ready. Plain and simple. We'll have enough personnel, but it's just not like the chief said with the boots on the ground, the uniforms and all that. We're going to be working with the community, for the community. And a lot of our personnel now are from the very places that we patrol. They're members of the community as well. So we'll be working together with all our religious leaders, all the different community organizations. We'll be working hand in hand so we have legitimate outlets to express whatever the emotion is, as long as it doesn't involve ruining someone else's day. And that's we'll have to draw that line, and we'll have that delicate balance in place. Well, if it's up to my druthers, when we make an arrest, that's because we've exhausted all other means, for sure. But if we've gone to that point where we've had to make an arrest, this is where it's going to get a little dicey because we have a new district attorney with a different set of principles that sometimes conflict with ours in law enforcement. And that is, we're going to have that conversation with his office, and we'll see where it takes us.
Let me follow up on that as well, though. Because, Pete, what you're saying, let's bring truth to this. We had assaults on police officers. We had attempted murder on police officers, grievous injuries at a fractured skull, broken leg, and other injuries. Those are all prosecuted, and those are currently before the courts for punishment, for justice, if you will, for those vicious attacks that occurred. However, we also made a number of arrests for curfew violations. That was the vast majority of arrests in Los Angeles were for people who are out after the curfew was established and felt that it did not apply to them. They weren't an essential worker. They just felt that they had the right to continue in a community that we had declared a local emergency because we could not assure the community that it would be safe. In my view, law enforcement has always been a continuum. You seek voluntary compliance. You give advice, counsel, warnings. You make citations. You make physical arrests. Prosecutions are on that same continuum. All arrests don't end up in a booking, and all bookings don't end up in prosecutions. I supported and will continue to support that the vast number of arrests that were for curfews, that the action of the making the arrest itself served the purpose of stopping the action. As you look at our after action report, the department that was released and is available online, you'll see the drastic drop in attacks and violence that occurred after the curfew was established, and in the first few days, a series of arrests that were needed to be made that capped on that Monday. After that, the arrests became far and few between, and by Thursday, the curfew had been lifted. So the constriction of public movement, it was terrible. I will tell you, as Sheriff Villanueva said, I was a sergeant in 1992. When I stood as a chief at the Grove on that Saturday, spoke with the mayor about the local emergency, about a curfew, about the National Guard, I was devastated. To lose a city in that sense, I prayed it would never happen again, but it did. But our actions that followed from that, including the curfew arrests, Pete, everything does not end up with a prosecution with a DA or CA. It's not necessary if the action itself was sufficient to restore order, which it did, and allow us to move forward. Now, those will say, well, you make an arrest, if you don't prosecute the person, what's to stop them from re-emerging? This was the first curfew in Los Angeles in 30 years. I'm praying it's the last one for the next 30 years. So I'm not worried about if it happens again. People are going to come out and they're going to say, well, it wasn't prosecuted last time, so therefore I'm going to just go out here and violate the curfew anyways. I understand your pessimism. I choose to see, so thank you. So I won't get in this diatribe back and forth, but I think I've tried to answer the question that I believe prosecuting discretion exists for a reason, and I support it.
How do you guys get through to any agitators out there?
So let's go with Steve, and then we'll come back, okay, and we'll organize this.
Going back to what you said a second ago, you were talking about that you didn't want to talk about strategy. You wanted to talk about the other stuff. And I would tell you that there are a great many business owners who would like to know what your strategy is to protect property next time around. And also to that, to Pete's point, the reports that came out over the weekend were criticizing the way that was handled back there.
Sure.
So
So
let us know a little bit of what your strategy is.
Sure. What I'm trying to avoid, Steve, is the imagery that law enforcement is leaning forward in an aggressive posture, that it's going to be so.
How can you reassure the business owners and the people of Los Angeles that they're safe?
Because we will make every effort to provide for their safety, in part by what we're doing today to promote a sense of protest, of demonstrations, of expression of anger and frustration, and not resorting to violence. For our response, we'll have added deployment. The entire department will be in uniform. We'll have shifting resources so as to bolster the number of officers, including a mobilization if that's what's necessary. National Guard if that becomes necessary. Those models are out there. Our execution this past year during the summer was problematic. We had missteps at the senior level of the organization, not on the officers that were on the streets. I think by the vast majority of them stood admirably and with valor. But I'll close by saying we saw also during the national elections on November 3rd, we saw with the inauguration of January 20th, an organization that changed its posture and command and control, that bolstered its resources so there were ample number of officers available, including the event at Echo Park, which we drew added resources to have contingencies that a year ago we perhaps would not have had, because we would not anticipate that we would see violence. This has been a city that has enjoyed a long period of time without people resorting to riotous acts of violence, arson, looting, and attacks. That, however, has now been broken, and it's my prayer that coalitions such as we have behind us and all of our communities will find a way to be united and be peaceful in their expression and not resort to violence. I'm going to ask for one more questions out of patience to our group, which, by the way, each of the members here are available to talk with you, and ask one more.
About assuring the residents of Los Angeles County that they'll be safe, whether it's a show of force or not a show of force. But I guess what I'm getting at is that a lot of people are very disappointed with the way things went down last year. Business owners, the law enforcement responded, or in their opinion, lack of response.
Well, I can tell you this, as I said earlier, there's a learning curve involved, and I learned a lot as sheriff myself in 2020 about how civil unrest unfold, and what my office can do and what our potential can do in terms of mobilizing resources to impact the problem as it unfolds in real time. And it's those lessons learned will be applied now, and I agree with the chief. We're going to definitely work hard to make sure there is no violence, there is no issue of a protest that spirals out of control and becomes what we saw last May and June. And that's my commitment as sheriff, that we're going to make sure that does not happen. And I can tell every business owner they will not be abandoned. We'll be standing side by side with them. We'll make sure their businesses, their jobs, their livelihood that drives the economic engine here in Southern California will remain intact, and we'll make sure it's a very peaceful process.
What's your guys' message to agitators out there who don't see this press conference or don't care about it?
Well, people are out there just agitating for the sake of agitating because they ascribe to the whole this anarchist viewpoint. There will be consequences for them. I promise that.
Last weekend we see the life of White Lives Matter already. You guys response to that. White Lives Matter already.
Again, that was a protest that began peacefully, but it devolved into a conflict between Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, and they declared unlawful assembly, and that's the typical scenario. And they broke it up, but when it got to that point. But up until then, you have to respect the First Amendment rights of both groups, and that's our obligation.
Thank you all.
Right?